we're in Genesis chapter 15, and it's this mysterious chapter sort of shrouded in sort of prophetic word and in this mysterious movement of God between these animals and these sort of strange things that are happening. And so we're gonna go through it together this morning. And what I'm gonna say to you is this, what I always say: can we slow down this morning? And can we ask for God to speak to us? Can we ask God to reveal himself to us again today? Because with these stories that we know really well, sometimes we miss it because we think, yeah, I know that story about Abraham, big deal. Can we do that together today? One person is ready and they're with me. Let's do it. So after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. Well, we should note this first. This phrase, the word of the Lord came, is a really common thing in the Old Testament. We see it all over the place with prophets. Yes, as you read the Old Testament, you see this, the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. But this actually only appears twice in Genesis, and both are actually here in this chapter. The word of the Lord, as it's written here, only comes twice. In chapter 15, verse 1, and chapter 15, verse 4. And as Walter Brueggemann notes then, this is actually potentially the most important chapter in the entire Abrahamic tradition. Guys, this is it. If you want to understand the Abrahamic tradition, you need to understand this chapter. It's so important. We're going to get some serious prophetic insights today. We're going to learn something significant about our God today through this chapter. And so in this important chapter, we should expect these things. So God speaks to Abram, fear not, I'm your shield, and your reward shall be very great. How are we to understand and think of these three things? Fear, shield, and reward. Right? First, fear. Is Abraham a man of fear? Well, kind of, isn't he? So Abraham gets called by God in chapter 12. Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. If you look to chapter 12, it actually reads something like this. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you and make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. Shortly after these things, after God calls Abraham, he's on his way down through Egypt. He's like, yeah, God's called me. Let's go, right? Y'all know that let's go feeling? Probably right before you fail, usually. Pride comes before the fall, right? Abraham's feeling so bold, right? He's going down to Egypt and he's like, oh, wait a second, my wife is super hot. He's like an evangelical preacher, right? Have you seen these evangelical preachers? They always talk about how hot their wives are. That's like the first thing they do when they come to a conference. Think about this in February when the Youthquake speaker comes. I bet you any money they will talk about how hot their wife is. I don't know why they do it, they just do. It's amazing. Anyway, so Abraham is coming down through Egypt, and he's terrified that they're gonna kill him to take his wife, because she's really attractive. Holla holla for those of you with attractive significant others. Y'all afraid you're gonna get murdered? I don't know. And so Abraham's like, oh, I don't know about this. I have an idea. Say that you're my sister. Say that you're my sister. That'll save my tail, right? Oh, Abraham, man of great faith, right? I have an idea. I don't really trust that God's gonna do this thing, so if you don't mind saying you're my sister, that'd be really great. Yeah, weird, right? I don't know about that. Then in chapter 15, right here, God makes this incredible promise to Abraham that we're talking about this morning. He's gonna promise him an heir. No, it's not gonna be somebody just from your house. It's not gonna be a slave. It's not gonna be Eliezer of Damascus. It's gonna be your own son. And right after this, what's he gonna do? Oh man, he's gonna take matters into his own hands and have a child with a slave, right? He's gonna sleep with Hagar to try to get the line going, even though God's just promised him this great thing. So Abraham he's living in some serious fear. He's trying to take matters into his own hands. Actually, chapter 12 and chapter 15 sort of mirror each other in this way. Abraham's afraid also that God's not gonna give him the land. And since his loins can barely function, it's a politically correct way of saying that, and Sarah's womb is closed, he don't think any child's gonna be delivered. So the call from barrenness had to be a false alarm, right? You're gonna get a child. Do you know how old we are? Do you know how hard it is to reproduce at this age? We couldn't reproduce when we were young. You think we're gonna do it now? But don't be afraid finds an important place then, assuring Abraham and ultimately Sarah that Yahweh, the true God, is gonna guide and deliver them, and they shouldn't fear, but they should trust. Second, I am your shield. Usually I am your shield in the Old Testament functions before like an oracle of salvation. We see this in Isaiah chapter 7, Isaiah chapter 10. And it's also a common military metaphor. So it actually could read something like this: the God of Abraham fights for his people and protects his kings. They need not be afraid, for their God is going to fight on their behalf, and ultimately he's going to lead them into salvation. Abraham, you don't have to fear, man. I'm your shield. I'm going to protect you. Third, your reward will be great. Time and time again, in Israel's scriptures, and actually in the New Testament, we find that God presents reward to those who are obedient. This is actually counter our sort of handed down evangelical structures. Do you know what I mean when I say that? Usually we think, don't do anything for reward because it's a bad motive. Except throughout the Old Testament, we see that God rewards those who are faithful to him. Store up for yourselves not treasures on earth, right? But treasures in heaven, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So there actually is this premise of reward that's very good. You seek those things which are above, right? You seek those things which are beyond. God is Abraham's great reward. So Abraham receives these words of comfort, and you know how he responds? He responds issuing a double protest. Look there. Right, yeah, okay, so you're gonna give me land and a child, but here's the thing though, I have no child, and Eliezer of Damascus is gonna be my heir. Oh, also, in case you didn't catch it, I don't have a child. So I don't know how you're gonna do this. And God is gonna lead Abraham and show him the stars. Abraham finds himself in barrenness. Do you see this? And the promise of God delays even to the point of Abraham's doubt. Abraham doubts God. And it's actually the common faith of all of us that we have to trust and hope in the face of barrenness, in the face of hardship and despair, even when all we see around us is barrenness, hardship, and despair. We actually have to trust something beyond what we see in front of us as followers of God. Do you understand the nature of Abraham's faith? Let me ask you this. Have you ever found yourself in a really hard situation and waiting for God to act? You're afraid, you're doubting, you're insecure, you're barren, and you're wondering if God is going to indeed produce good fruit and show himself in a significant way. The common fate of the people of God, as I've just said, is trusting in the face of this hardship. And the temptation that we have in these situations when things are hard is to take matters into our own hands. The temptation when things get tough is to say, no, she's actually just my sister. No. The temptation when things get tough is to say, we're gonna produce a child on our own because we're not exactly sure if God's gonna do this. And here's what we do. We lie and we cheat and we manipulate and we steal because we need to take control of our own lives. We need to make it happen for ourselves. Have you ever done this? Oh man, that's like my life story. When I started doing counseling in my second year, one of the things that I realized more than anything is all that I do is try to manipulate situations. All that I do is try to control, because my life was such chaos growing up with my parents and my brother, who I didn't mention but has a serious drug problem and actually robbed my mom and I a couple years ago. These things, I just try to control these things in my life because it's easier, right? It's easier to control them. It's easier to be like Abraham and to try to find our own ways. But we're called to trust in the promise even when the evidence against the promise is all around us. And so God actually speaks in a way that reestablishes the promise. The word of the Lord comes again. You see the second time in this text, the second time in Genesis as a whole, we see the word of the Lord comes and he says, this man's not gonna be your heir, you're gonna have your own son. And God takes him out and he shows him the stars and he says, if you can count the stars in the sky, that's how great your offspring's gonna be. This is how great the promise is gonna be. And if you're like me, you read this and you think, what in the world do stars have to do with this promise? Great, stars, who cares? What about the kid? What about the land? And I think our temptation is to miss and misunderstand this ancient Near Eastern discourse. Guys, this is a revelation. Are you with me this morning? This is a revelation. God doesn't present Abraham with a concrete argument as to how he's gonna produce this great lineage for him. No, he shows him the stars and he says, the very same God, me, who made these stars and put them in the sky, can you even count them? I'm the God that's telling you that I'm gonna give you a child. The very revelation of God comes to Abraham. He is reminded that this God who creates and sustains is the God who's gonna give him a child. And we struggle, just like Abraham, to be certain of the saving action of God in our lives. That he's going to heal us and rescue us and restore us. And this emergence of being certain can't actually be based on fleshly realities, but on the awareness that God is God. Friends, the same God who gives the promise is the one who makes the promise believable. And your tendency in your life is going to be looking to the fleshly realities, the things that are around you, instead of looking to that which is beyond, right? Look at the stars in the sky. I'm the same God that put them there, and I'm telling you that I got you. I've got you. You need not fear. I'm your shield and your great reward. Friends, the same God who gives the promise is the same God who makes the promise believable. And only on the grounds of the revelation of God being God can the assurance of Abraham's safe future be established. And I ask you this morning, do you need this assurance? Do you need this reminder? Hear this. This is the most profound thing I'm going to say this morning. God is God. Exactly. But you actually need to be reminded of this, don't you? Guys, God is God, and we actually have to allow him to be God. He doesn't need our permission. Of course he doesn't, but you can actually keep him from being God of your life. You can actually keep him from doing things in your life. Yeah, no, he doesn't need your permission, but you can sure stop him. We actually have to allow him to work in our midst. We actually have to allow him to heal, mend, and restore. And the temptation, much like the temptation of Abraham, is to look at our reality and immediately conclude that God's not going to show up or he's not working. We lack patience and trust to maintain faithfulness in the face of the fleshly certainty that nothing's going to change. Hear me today. Our God, Abraham's God, points you towards the revelation of the divine. He points to the stars in the sky and he says, you see the stars in the sky? I'm the very same God that put those stars in the sky. You think I can't give you a kid? Do you think I can't deliver you from this sin in your life? You think I can't restore you, heal you, or transform you? You think I don't love you? I'm the God who sustains everything. Friends, this is a revelation of the divine. And God is at work. And our temptation this year is going to be to take things into our own hands, to examine our fleshly realities and forget the very character and nature of God. But I want to urge us again to allow God to be God, to look to him, to trust him, and to regain wonder for the small miracles in our lives. And when you're afraid, doubting, wavering, and insecure, and just outright barren, remember that you need not be afraid, because the God of the universe is your shield and your great reward. We have to again today, as the people of God, return to trusting him for all that he wants to accomplish. See, here's what happens now. Abraham is going to believe God now that he sees the stars in the sky, but he doesn't feel like regenerative power in his loins, and he doesn't have like new expectations for Sarah's womb. It's just that by this revelation, he sees who God is again. And he's allowing God to be God. He's looking beyond his fleshly realities. He no longer has flesh and blood expectations, but he's come to rely on the promise speaker. He's taking God at his word. The reality remains for us, though, that this is challenging, isn't it? Of course. But Abraham believes God, and it's credited to him as righteousness. Nowhere else in the Old Testament is righteousness credited on behalf of faith. Usually righteousness is ethical in nature. It's something you do. You're righteous if you do the right things. But here now, faith is righteousness. It's fascinating. And I want to suggest this morning that righteousness here in the Abrahamic sense is taking God at his word. So Genesis announces again what it means to be human creatures that we're created to be, righteous. It means to trust God's future and to live assured of that future, even in the deathly present. Walter Brueggemann says this righteousness means the end of every ism, not only moralism, dogmatism, pietism, existentialism, positivism, Marxism, capitalism, humanism, because every ism is a way of keeping control of the present, but this new righteousness means to let go of control of the present for the sake of a new Genesis. Friends, in letting go of control, we find ourselves living within the framework of an enhanced quality of life. I might suggest the truest form of life. For not only ourselves, but the entirety of our community. This righteousness then means taking God at his word and living in faithful obedience. So God does a couple things now. We're running short on time, so I have to cut down quickly. God reminds him of who he is. He's the God who called him from Ur of the Chaldeans. He's the God who's called him and will establish him. And so so Abraham asks again, the question's no longer about the land, or the child rather, but it's now about the land. How am I going to know that we're going to get the land? And he says, all right, get me these animals, cut them in half and line them up. I don't suggest trying this at home unless you're Dan Gabor or AJ Crocker, okay? You don't want to be chopping animals in half at your house and lining them up. But before God does this great act, here's what he says. There's going to be a time of great suffering. There's a prophecy here. Look at it. There's going to be a time of suffering. We know this is slavery in Egypt. So there's actually a prophecy of 400 years that you're actually going to suffer and be afflicted before you actually get the land that I'm promising you. Friends, God's promises, his assurance in your life, it takes waiting sometimes. 400 years of slavery, some serious waiting. But he's going to accomplish it. And so he takes these animals and he cuts them in half. If we turn to Jeremiah, which we don't have time to do right now, but you can write it down if you want, Jeremiah 34, 17 and 19. What we find about this strange ritual is this. They would cut these animals in half and they would pass through the animals as a sign of their word. And what they're basically saying is this: if I don't keep my word, curse be upon me. So if Dan and I are going to do something together, we're going to enter into this agreement. We're going to chop the animals in half and we're going to walk through them. And we're going to say, I say, if I don't keep my part of the agreement, may God curse me and may you cut me in half just like these animals. So God is actually saying to Abraham, my word is secure. And if I don't do what I say that I'm going to do, curse be upon me and cut me in half. But normally, both parties have to enter through. But notice that Abraham doesn't walk through the animals. Only God does. Friends, this is a one-sided covenant. God is saying that no matter what happens, Abraham, I'm going to accomplish what I'm going to accomplish. Regardless of you or what you do or where you go, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a people and I'm going to make a land. Friends, God is giving his word. He's demonstrating commitment. But notice, Abraham doesn't go through, right? No matter what you do, no matter how far you go, I'm going to make this happen. We find similar covenants in Exodus 34 and Matthew 26 and Mark 14. We find the covenant that Yahweh gives to the Israelites in Egypt. We find the new covenant that Jesus makes in the New Testament, but they're different covenants than this one. Because in those covenants, they demand action from you and me. But in this one, God's saying, I'm going to do it entirely on my own. Abraham does, however, respond in obedience because by faith, we have to live into the reality that goes beyond mere flesh. Friends, God here in Genesis is making a people. This is the establishment of the people of God. And without this Abrahamic covenant, there's no assurance of a people and there's no assurance of a great nation in the line of Abraham. This great nation of whom Abraham becomes the father of Isaac and Jacob and David and Solomon and eventually Jesus. Friends, this is the beginning of the line of Jesus. This is the securing of the people and the nation. The ancestry that we now partake. Guys, the God who cut this covenant with Abraham long ago is the very same God who establishes a covenant around Jesus Christ. A covenant not sealed by this ancient ritual practice whereby God has to curse himself if he doesn't accomplish it, but a covenant sealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. I'm landing the plane. Here we go. If you've missed everything this morning, hear me say this. Don't miss this. God didn't have to curse himself because he brought about all of his promises, both in giving the land and the people, with the climax of Israel's history in Jesus, the Messiah. All the promises of God come to life in Jesus. Friends, if the very revelation and deep care and purpose of the living God can be demonstrated through stars in the sky, how much more in the sending of his Son? The God of the universe has acted in the most miraculous revelation, the very saving action of God, the purposes of God, the deep care and compassion all come forth in this revelation of Messiah Jesus. And this one-sided covenant, this assurance that God's going to bring about his purposes, bring about a people regardless of their action, is similar to the good news we find in our gospel stories. Guys, God's doing something in Jesus we could never do for ourselves. He's saving us. And our temptation is always going to be to examine our fleshly realities and forget the very character and nature of God. When you look at your life around you, your temptation this year and in your entire life is going to be to forget the very character and nature of God. But I want to urge us, please, again, allow God to be God. Look to him, look to Jesus, trust him, regain wonder for every small miracle that takes place around you. Remember the ways that he's blessed you, guys. He's saved you. And when you're afraid and doubting and wavering and insecure and you're just outright barren, be reminded you need not be afraid. The God of the universe is your shield and your great reward. And if he can establish the stars in the sky, if he's willing to send his very son to bring about the new age of human existence, you think he can't do miraculous things in your life? We have to again today, as the people of God, return to trusting him for everything he wants to accomplish. And there's no other response but the response of Abraham, recorded by the pastor in Hebrews chapter 12. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called. Friends, God's calling today. Do you hear him? He wants you to respond in faith, a faith that can't be divorced from following him. Let us today lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance and obedience the race that he set before us. Looking only to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, may we again today see beyond the fleshly realities. We have to see the destiny of our common faith, guys. We might be barren as the people of God, but as we live in that barrenness sometimes, can we together fix our eyes on Jesus? Can we look to him? So I end here. Are you going to respond to this call today? Can you, again, let God be God this year? That's the profound thing. Can you let God be God? And ultimately place your life back in his hands, because God's made a new Genesis. God's making a new people, and he has been ever since he cut this covenant in Genesis 15. He's been making this people. Ever since the beginning of this book, he's been working something all the way through. Do you see it? And he's calling us because we're a part of that. He's calling us to let go of control of the present, controlling everything in your life, and embrace a new Genesis. Look beyond the fleshly realities and look to Jesus.